All right, well, good evening and welcome to the 2023 Silber-Obrecht Lecture presented by the Institute for Islamic, Christian, and Jewish Studies, known as the ICJS. I'm Heather Miller-Rubens, the Executive Director and Roman Catholic Scholar here at ICJS. In addition to welcoming our guests in the room with us today at Loyola University, Maryland, I want to extend my welcome to viewers from around the world watching via YouTube. The Silber-Obrecht Lecture is a two-night series of endowed academic lectures intended to advance the emerging field of interreligious and interfaith studies. The development of this field is an indication of the growing understanding in societies, as well as among scholars, that there are many possible responses to the realities of religious pluralism: theological, philosophical, historical, scriptural, ethical, legal, praxeological, and institutional. And these responses to religious pluralism need thoughtful and reasoned inquiry. Because of this need, ICJS is honored to create the first endowed lecture focused on advancing the questions that are shaping this field of inquiry. This year's inaugural Silber-Obrecht Lecture marks the beginning, indeed the foundation, for what ICJS expects to be a distinguished series of academic lectures here in Baltimore to advance the field of interreligious and interfaith studies. Although ICJS funds and manages the lectureship, we could not do this work without our partners from 5 esteemed Baltimore educational institutions: Goucher College, the SNF Agora Institute at Johns Hopkins University, Loyola University, Maryland, Morgan State University's Center for Religion and Cities, and St. Mary's Seminary and University. I want to particularly thank Loyola University, Maryland for hosting the inaugural lecture this year. Future Silber-Obrecht lectures will happen biannually, and the hosting location will rotate among our program partners here in Baltimore, Maryland. We look forward to inviting you to the next lectures in 2025. The lecture series is named in honor of Sidney and Jean Silber and Charles and Peggy Obrecht, in recognition of their longtime commitment to improving interreligious relationships and understanding. Before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to let you know that following tonight's lecture, we will have a Q&A session. All viewers, both those in the room and online via YouTube, can ask questions by using the online tool Slido. On the screen now are instructions for how you can access this tool. You do not need to download the app, you just need to use a browser to go to slido.com. When you see the message that asks if you're joining as a participant, type in our event code for tonight, which is 593-9430. Then you can type your question in the open box on the screen, and it will magically appear on my phone. You can submit a question anytime during the lecture. In Slido, all members of the audience will be able to see the questions asked by any audience member and even upvote questions that you would like to see answered. At about 8 p.m., I will ask Professor Clooney to address as many questions as time allows. And now I'd like to introduce our esteemed speaker. Francis Clooney is the Parkman Professor of Divinity and Professor of Comparative Theology at Harvard. After earning his doctorate in South Asian languages and civilizations at the University of Chicago, he taught at Boston College for 21 years before joining the Harvard Divinity School faculty in 2005. From 2010 to 2017, he was the director of the Center for the Study of World Religions at Harvard. Professor Clooney is a leading figure globally in comparative theology, a discipline distinguished by attentiveness to the dynamics of theological learning deepened through the study of traditions other than one's own. In his scholarship, Professor Clooney focuses on Sanskrit and Tamil theological commentary traditions and is a recognized expert in Catholic Hindu exchanges. He has written 22 books, including extensive writings on the Jesuit missionary tradition, particularly in India, on the early Jesuit Pan-Asian discourse on reincarnation, and on the dynamics of dialogue and interreligious learning in the contemporary world. He is currently the president of the Catholic Theological Society of America and a fellow of the British Academy. And his most recent honorary doctorate was awarded to Professor Clooney by Regis College at the University of Toronto. He is a Roman Catholic priest and has been a member of the Society of Jesus for 50 years. He is currently writing an intellectual autobiography tentatively titled Priest and Scholar, Catholic and Hindu, a Love Story. He serves regularly in a Catholic parish on weekends. It is my true honor to introduce Frank Clooney as the inaugural Silber-Obrecht Lecturer. His talk this evening is entitled, What is the State of the Emerging Field of Interreligious and Interfaith Studies? Please join me in welcoming Dr. Clooney.
So I would like to begin by expressing how honored I am to be the inaugural lecturer in this series. It's a great enterprise, this Institute for Islamic Christian Jewish Studies, over the past, near 40 years now. And I'm honored to be part of this great tradition and to undertake these lectures tonight. I'm very delighted to see Charles and Peggy here in the audience. It's a great honor to be in your presence. And I also thank Jean Silber, who I believe may be present for part of the lecture tomorrow night. I'm also grateful to Heather Miller-Rubens, to Ben Sachs for their hospitality and their wonderful staff in helping to arrange everything that we have put together to make this come true and be possible tonight. And Shubha Pathak is my respondent tomorrow night. And I'm looking forward to hearing from her as well. Thank you for coming here from American University to be with us. The theme that, and the purpose of these lectures that Heather read to you, which I had also written down to read, the modes of response to the reality of religious pluralism, theological, philosophical, historical, scriptural, ethical, and so on, is a mighty theme and a major theme. And the idea that I could in a short time undertake to say something magisterial about this is indeed very daunting. I'm sort of pleased by the fact that knowing that I can't really do that, I am at least bringing a different angle to this. So in terms of the Islamic, Christian, Jewish conversation, which is a great, essential, long-term conversation, my entry into it is rather by the Hindu-Christian, or even more precisely, Hindu-Catholic conversation. I come from a slightly different angle, therefore. I have many friends who've been involved in Jewish-Catholic dialogue, Jewish-Catholic-Muslim dialogue over the decades, but my own work and my own understanding of my task in life and in these lectures is to think of it from outside that conversation from another perspective. I'll bring a little bit of that in when I get a little bit autobiographical later in this lecture tonight. And tomorrow night, I'll talk a little bit about some of my translation work of medieval Hindu text and bring that angle into the conversation. So to begin, without being entirely over-daunted by the fact of where we are tonight, what I'll try to do is read the present moment in terms of its past and in terms of its future and in terms of what we shall do. I don't believe that one can simply go back and say, here's what the past is all about. I think we know that it's actually very complicated, the impossibility of pinning things down. And looking at the future is really guessing if this is where we are at the current moment, then where are we likely to go? What are the choices and options before us as we look forward? So really looking to the past and looking to the future are really two ways of talking about the present moment. And therefore, I'll be very interested and excited to hear from the questions in the audience and the online audience in terms of what you see in relation to what I say. The thesis, insofar as there is one tonight, is to say that granting that interfaith and interreligious studies are flourishing, and I think we've reached kind of a solidity and a coming together of the disciplines in a very interesting and persuasive way at the current moment, is to keep the interfaith and the interreligious together. And I'll talk about this a little bit more later. But as far as I can see, the healthy tension between interfaith conversations, interfaith learning among believers of different traditions, and what one might call, without being too rigid about it, the interreligious conversations and studies that go on in the academy, is far better off if the two conversations are always in dialogue with one another. That the faith position and that the faith that drives many of us in our interreligious experiences, activities, desires, and hopes not be put aside for the sake of the professionalization of the field. So really what I'll be talking about tonight is how to keep faith in the conversation and why keeping faith in the conversation is really what matters. We need the interreligious, we need the professionalization, but in order to do that, we need to honor and give space for people of faith to lead the way. With that in mind, I'd like to say that in doing this work, I was somewhat helped by the fact that there's incredible publications in the past 10 years or so bringing together the interfaith and interreligious fields. And I'll just read to you some of the titles of volumes that have come out, very impressive volumes that cross the boundaries. First of all, there are journals that go on for the past 30 years or so. The Journal of Hindu-Christian Studies, founded about 1990. Studies in Jewish-Christian relations, starting in 2005, I believe, about 18 volumes at this point. The Wiley-Blackwell Companion to Interreligious Dialogue, 2013. Jewish-Muslim Relations, Past and Present, 2017. Interreligious Interfaith Studies, Defining a New Field, came out in 2018. The Rutledge Handbook of Christian-Muslim Relations, also 2018. Interreligious Studies, Dispatches from an Emerging Field, 2020. The Rutledge Handbook of Hindu-Christian Relations, 2021. The Rutledge Handbook of Buddhist-Christian Studies, 2022. The Brill Companion to Comparative Theology, 2022. We're honored to have the editor, Pim Valkenburg, present tonight for this magnificent volume on comparative theology from Brill. And then finally, just come out, the Georgetown Companion to Interreligious Studies, 2022. Just looking at these volumes, which I've taken up a good bit of my shelf space in my office in the last year or so, pondering these volumes and what's going on in them, is quite incredible that there is this proliferation of learning and also proliferation of people trying to put together and think about how these different fields, be it Jewish, Christian, Muslim, be it Hindu, Buddhist, being Muslim, Jewish, and so on, how are these fields working out? And that there's a great effort to pull this together and to think about it in a more concerted fashion. I think volumes like this help us in the 21st century of realizing just how broad the scope is, that we're no longer at the beginning of interreligious relations or interreligious studies by any means, and I think everyone here and online tonight knows that, but that we're at the point where these fields can be rationalized to some extent, pulled together, matured in a certain way to say, where are we after so many years, 50 or 100, perhaps thousands of years of interreligious relations? We're pulling it together in these various magnificent volumes. And the volumes go about it, each one in their own way. The Rutledge Handbook of Christian-Muslim Studies Relations, for instance, deals first historically, the beginnings of the traditions and the beginning of the relations, what happened in the Middle Ages, what happened in modern, early modern and the modern period between Christians and Muslims, and then a whole series of kind of concerted studies on Muslims regarding the Bible, Christians regarding the Quran, Christians regarding the Prophet Muhammad, perceptions of God in the two traditions, perceptions of the human in the two traditions, and then Islam, Christianity, and contemporary society. Or the Handbook of Buddhist Christian Studies, a section on theory and method, which of course academic books need, some sampling of historical studies, historical encounters, contemporary conversations, what's going on in Christian-Buddhist dialogue, social engagement, pastoral care, the challenge of interreligious education, and then forward-looking constructive dialogue among the traditions. The Rutledge Handbook of Hindu-Christian Relationship, somewhat of a similar range, and I won't go all through the details to save us a bit of time. But what authors, editors are trying to do nobly in these volumes is begin to sort out what are the methodological principles, what are the beginning points, what has happened historically, and where are we today in social, political, cultural settings in various countries, and what are we going to do as we move forward? And this happens again and again. The Brill Companion to Comparative Theology before 1985 is a starting point. essays on Jewish, Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, Chinese understandings of comparative work, comparative theology, trying to see these relations from not only the Christian side, but from the perspective of each tradition, looking at the others, making sense theologically, new perspectives in comparative theology. Where is the field going? And I'll try to get to this by the end of my comments tonight. How are we thinking about the future as new, younger generations begin to lead in the field? We can't simply repeating where we were in the past. And the Georgetown Companion to Interreligious Studies, the concerns that begin, the concerns we begin with when we think about the interreligious or the interfaith. What is left out? What are the margins? Which kinds of conversations are privileged? Which kinds of conversations interreligiously are ignored because the people are not people in power, because the people are in groups that are biased against, because they're in little traditions as opposed to great traditions and therefore are ignored. All of this the Georgetown Companion bravely tries to take on. Close reading, close study of texts, interreligious education, what's going on in schools and programs, what's going on in churches and temples and synagogues, how is learning taking place across the boundaries, and again, a section looking forward. So these volumes, we could spend hours, and we don't have hours, simply looking at these different volumes and where they lead us. But I think it shows in a way that this series is timely, this new series, because people all over the place, both practitioners and scholars, at very large academic meetings, but also in local communities, faith communities here and throughout the world, are beginning to say, where are we, and how to pull together the things we're talking about. And I think this lecture series and all the lectures that follow will be part of this. What do we learn from such volumes? And that was another thing that tortured me in the past months, was trying to say, how can I talk about them without actually telling you what's in them? I've just done the best I could. But you certainly get, if you took the authors in all these volumes, some volumes have 10 authors, some have 30 authors, who's who in the field of interreligious studies? Who are the leading figures, most of whom are practitioners as well as scholars? Some may be more on the scholarly end of the spectrum, others more on the interfaith or practical, local aspect. But you're getting a long list of people from late in their careers to early in their careers who are working and thinking these things out. When people talk about where has the field been, where is the field going, how do we learn, all of this, I think these volumes are beginning to pull together in a way that can become, in a sense, canonical, to look back over the next years and say, well, as that volume says, as this volume says, we've accomplished this, we've gotten this far, this is where we find ourselves in 2023, 2025, 2027. In some sense, it can be daunting and even mind-blowing, overwhelming, to realize that none of us really understands the full range of interreligious activities, interfaith possibilities in the time in which we live. We all do our concerted work, be it Islamic, Christian, Jewish, being it Hindu, Buddhist, being it Catholic, Hindu, and so on and so on. But very rarely can we stop back and realize everything we do are simply part of a much larger pattern. And looking through the books like the ones I mentioned, I think is an incredible step forward. All these fields are professionalized in a good sense, in the sense that now there are kind of go-to markers, go-to standards by which people can begin, in fact, to understand what's worked well in the field, what are the leading questions that are brought forward, how do we avoid the mistakes of the past in thinking about traditions' relationship to one another. A lot of this, I think, is being worked out in these volumes. The volumes also show us is that it's no longer a case that there's Christianity in the West and the other religions somewhere else. I know when I first started learning from Hinduism and first went to South Asia some 50 years ago, you did, not literally, because I grew up in New York City, and there was already a temple in New York City at that point, a Hindu temple. But basically, you would go somewhere far away in order to meet people in thriving cultures of the other religious traditions. And now I think we're very aware, and we're very totally, it's all over the place in our context, in our families even, in our communities, on our campuses, that the interreligious reality and the presence of other traditions flourish where we are. And that change in the dynamic, the map has been all messed up in a good sense. not going there from here, but rather where we are, the possibilities of flourishing around us. And therefore, as people like my colleague at Harvard, Diana Eck, have been pointing out for some 30 years, America itself is a multi-religious reality. We know that. That's why we're here tonight. And therefore, when we think about how the world is interreligiously pluralized, interreligiously diverse and complicated, we're really talking about our own cities, our own campuses, our own towns, our own families, the next generation. All of this is inevitable where we are today. And I think also, perhaps related to that, is that ethnically speaking or culturally speaking, family speaking, you can no longer predict, well, if you're from South Asia, you're probably a Hindu. If you're from Europe, you're not a Hindu. Or if you're a Buddhist, you're from Asia somewhere. No, I'm surrounded at Harvard Divinity School with American Buddhists. You can't predict, when somebody says, Islam is my faith, you can't predict where they're from, because there are so many choices being made in our country and our culture that change things. I think another thing that these volumes point out to us is, in a sort of overwhelming way that I think we can learn from, is that the past is far more complicated than we imagined it to be. There could be a tendency, I doubt if it would be a tendency among us gathered here tonight or those listening in online, of sort of saying that we have progressed from the lack of understanding and lack of appreciation in the past to a situation where finally in the 21st century, we're relating to one another in a creative fashion. And I think, well, that's true. I think I wouldn't deny progress or deny the fact that we've qualitatively entered a new phase of interreligious understanding by the way we relate to one another today. The historical studies that appear in these volumes, and then more micro studies in other contexts, constantly show us that hundreds of years ago or thousands of years ago, interreligious relations were incredibly complicated, incredibly subtle, and incredibly fruitful. And that the way we relate to one another today is at its best not entirely different from what our ancestors were doing. I think of, as an example, Klaus von Stach in Paderborn in Germany and now in Bonn in Germany. He and his colleagues in the doctoral program there have done considerable work, as others have as well, on the origins of Muslim-Christian relationships and the kinds of Christianity that are present in the consciousness of the earliest Muslim communities. And being aware that there wasn't any kind of monolithic sense of us and them or a vague category of people of the book, but already at the beginning of Islam, Jews, Christians, and Muslims were in interaction with one another in creative ways that led to changes in certainly the formative period of the Islamic community, but also among Jews and Christians, changing the way people were related to one another. My own work with Hinduism over the decades has done, as Heather has mentioned, good amount of work on Jesuit missionaries in India. And while there can be a tendency, and I think part of it would be justified, to say about the missionary period that in some ways it was clumsy at best, in some ways harmful, totally disregarding the values of other religious traditions. You hear horror stories from everywhere in the world about the demolition of sacred places of other religious traditions, the destruction of temples, the pushing aside social structures that belong to the religious traditions, missionaries who might come in and say, you are benighted pagans, and I am here to save you from the evils of your tradition. All of that went on, and I think we'd be naive to avoid that. And all the missionaries of, you might say, from after 1500, Western missionaries going to Asian countries or Africa or the Americas, there's often hand-in-hand relationship between the missionaries and the colonial powers. And I think we know about that. We know about the ways in which there's been a corruption of religious faith, corruption of religious intentions, by the fact that the ships that were carrying the missionaries were also carrying men with arms, and conquest was taking place. All of that is true. But what I think the essays in these volumes point out is that even in those contexts, there were people trying to understand mutually, trying to understand the other cultures, and make sense. So I've done the work with the Jesuits in India, figures ranging from Francis Xavier in the beginning of the Western Catholic presence in India around 1542 when Francis Xavier reached India, but also Robert de Nobili, Constantine Beschi, other Jesuits of the 16th, 17th, 18th century who were learning the languages, writing grammars, doing dictionaries, beginning to try to decipher the other traditions in a way that would do justice to the Christian message, but also not lose sight of what is articulated well and spiritually valuably in the other traditions. Or I found another example well outside my expertise, Jean de Brebeuf, who was one of the so-called North American martyrs, a Jesuit who was killed in French Canada in the 17th century, known when I was a child for the gruesome way in which he was tortured to death. Schoolboys loved things like that in my day, at least. The grotesque killing that took place. But he was also incredibly, again, a scholar of the native languages. He was also doing dictionaries. He was also struggling to find words in Iroquois or Huron-related languages for the terms of the Christian faith. Because he said, we shouldn't be here, we shouldn't be doing this unless there is some way in which we can understand what they mean by these words in their language. And so the incredible kind of range, I think, of sophistication. And as many of the more recent studies have shown, also the history cuts the other way. That the people of the other religious traditions, India, China, Japan, Africa, the Americas, were not simply passive either victims or beneficiaries of Christian activism, but in all these contexts, the people of the culture, whether they became Christian or not, were refashioning, recreating, rethinking the Christian message or what to do about the Christian message in terms of their own language and background. And that rather than seeing all the agency being on the side of the West, rather to realize that actually the complicated relationships were cutting both ways and the Christian gospel was changing in the cultures in which the Christian gospel was preached. That's 1500 and after. And if you go back to the Middle Ages in the West, or go back to early Christianity or to the Jewish tradition before Christianity, we begin to see that these complicated relationships have always been going on. And you could talk as well about Buddhist and Hindu relations in India, Islam and Hinduism in India, what happened when Buddhism made its way to China, that the past becomes overwhelming. And the past becomes as complicated as anything we can understand about ourselves today. So we can sometimes throw up our hands and say, oh, in the past it was simpler. There were people of different faiths and they talked to each other or killed each other, whatever. Whereas today it's much more subtle and complicated. I think we learn from the volumes that I mentioned, and also from other studies, very sophisticated and very deep, that we have hardly begun to understand the past of our interreligious relations. And certainly I'd plead, I think, again, we'd all agree on this, moving forward, while we need to live in the present moment, we do live in the present moment, we need to be thinking about responsibilities to one another today, we also need to simply keep doing the historical research to uncover where we came from. And what were the beginnings of our interrelationships over the centuries, over the millennia. And the reason for this, I think, is both knowledge helps, getting rid of false ideas about the past, and also to disabuse ourselves of the fact that inevitably progress is on our side. In some ways, we have progressed. And again, I would not take away from 21st century mutual understanding that is a beautiful reality more than in many parts of the past. But to see it as kind of an inevitable progress and that we are better than they were would be naive, because they were often struggling, Christians, Jews, Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, and others, with the same kinds of issues we're facing today. And what we think of as new in 21st century could just as well be 11th century or 1st century. And I think these volumes help us to point this out. To push further, though, I want to go into several questions that are a little bit more complicated and deeper. And for this, I would turn to the Georgetown Companion to Interreligious Learning, Interreligious Dialogue. And there's a wonderful article by Brian Pennington in that volume, in the first part, saying, well, if we step back and think about where we are in interfaith, interreligious studies. By implication, should we, even when we look to the past or when we talk about the present moment, should we be really using terms like interfaith and interreligious together? Do they really work together? Are they in harmony with one another? To preview in a few minutes, I'll say they need to be in dialogue. You need the academic and the faith praxis together, but it's not always a friendly relationship. It's not always a relationship that is without problems. But Pennington, in his short but very succinct article early in the Georgetown Companion, he makes 3 points that I think are salient for us to keep before us. First, is the interreligious learning a matter of theory, a kind of inquiry, or is it something that is learned only in action? That what kind of grounds can we move to when we begin to think of how people of different traditions are understanding one another, or how as a scholar one looks and understands the traditions in relationship to one another? What exactly are we looking for? And is it a matter of having to go to the great books, to the books that people write about their own and other people's religions? Or is it a matter of seeing what happens in practice? And I think he says it's an open question, and that if we go too far in one extreme or the other, it's only a matter of what people actually do. That would be too far. But if we only see it as a matter of clarifying the intellectual issues and trying to straighten things out among traditions, that also is detached from the lived reality of the different traditions. I'll come back to this point tomorrow, also in my lecture tomorrow. The second, what is the role of of theological inquiry? Does theology have a place in the realm of interfaith and interreligious relations? The short answer, of course, would be, well, what do you think theology is? And I think sometimes people are thinking of theology, he points out, as a matter of doctrine, as a matter of the staunchly held views of traditions, as kind of framing or predicting where they'll go interreligiously. But he's really also raising the point, is the field we're talking about, and we keep using the kind of hyphenated name interfaith, interreligious, is it a theological discipline, or is it an academic discipline of the study of religion? And I think what Pennington is trying to do, he's very committed to all kinds of levels of interfaith learning, is to say that it's not simple. That question is a real question that really needs to be answered, because on one level, the rigorous study of the issues involved and the kinds of essays that show up in these big volumes published by big presses is the academic and interreligious. And in that context, sometimes the positions of believers, the matters of faith, often fade and drift into the background. And therefore, what is required, he says, is to think about whether, as with, I think, comparative theology, comparative religion, theology of religion, history, cultural studies, whether there actually is a theological base. If one uses the loose term, faith-seeking understanding, is this a faith discipline where the inquiry tonight and the inquiry in this series over the next years is basically people of faith inquiring together about how shall we be and who shall we be? Or is it a matter that you can step away and say, well, it's not theological categories, it's sociological, cultural, historical, and so on. So I think Pennington puts that forward very well. And then he raises a question, the third one and the final one: how can a center hold after the world religions paradigm has been dissolved? And many of you who are quite aware of this, and I don't need to belabor it, that in the study of religion today, ironically, one of the most contested terms is religion. We are dedicated to the study of religion, maybe religions in the plural. Is there anything there that we are studying? And what seems to be the case, this is not simply academic abstractions, but rather aren't we really positing for the sake of some kind of management of the complexity of the world that there are different religions? And one can go back and trace these terms, the use of the word religion in the 17th, 18th, 19th century, and so on like that. We talk about religions and we reify realities that are more complex. And so we talk about Hinduism. Is there such a thing as Hinduism, singular, plural, or whatever? Is there such a thing as Buddhism? by extension, when we talk about Christianity or Judaism, are we really talking about fixed, containable religious traditions that can be in relationship to one another? Or in fact, should we dissolve those terms and pull out and stop using the word religion or religions? And the idea, I think, would be, and again, he's posing this as a question more than as a definitive answer, is that we too much are constraining complex living realities by putting them in the framework of religion, my religion, your religion, the founder of my religion, the founder of your religion, the sacred book of this religion, that religion, handbooks of Christian, Hindu, handbooks of Muslim, Christian, and so on. Wouldn't we be better, he poses as a question we need to take into account, if we stopped using the word and talked about the range of social studies, cultural studies, political studies, philosophical studies, and stop reifying them in terms of where the traditions stand in relationship to one another. This was a critique put to my work a number of years ago in a volume of essays about teaching comparative theology in the millennial classroom, a wonderful volume by Reed Lachlan and Mara Brecht. But one of the essays critiqued my work, saying that, well, Clooney is very good at what he does and does comparative theology, but it presumes that there are traditions that stand in relationship to one another. And that people like Clooney, but also people like John Donne at Notre Dame before me and other well-known figures, talk about crossing over and crossing back. And this essay in the volume raised the point and said, well, isn't that playing it safe? That if you talk about crossing over, the bridge is still there, you can cross back. Doesn't it make it simpler than it should be by saying that you can go from your tradition to the other, that there are traditions. Here's my tradition, your tradition, their tradition, and we can sort of visit each other and then go back home again. And the essay, and I think what Pennington is pointing to in a way is, again, that can be a way of reifying or putting in a fixed position realities that themselves are kind of integral and unchanging in relation with dynamic relations among them, but you're still there in the end of the day, the different traditions in relationship to one another. Now, what I personally think about this is that the terminology of religions does make sense to people who believe in faith traditions. That there are ways in which communities, their self-understanding, their practices, their traditions, their relationship to divine and transcendent realities allow for a certain kind of coherence that people of faith in their communities can justly say that they are in relationship to other communities and that they're not the same. So all my years of going to India, I don't think Hinduism is a simple thing, and I don't think Catholicism is a simple thing. But I don't think that Hinduism is Catholicism or Catholicism is Hinduism, or that I can't tell the difference. And I think what Pennington is raising, therefore, is a productive question in which we have to be thinking about how we use these terms and whether we would be better off not using them. I think what would happen, and this I would predict where it might go at this point, would be to be saying that if we let go of the term religion and the term religions, and if we open up the door to a kind of interreligious study or multiple religious study, then we might end up with something that wouldn't necessarily need words like faith or religion at all, and that one could justly, at the end of the day, do away with words like Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, except perhaps in teaching the introductory class. One would end up being able to talk about political relations, social relations, economic relations among peoples without pinning down where any particular person is. And I think some of this may be related to where individuals are. And I think certainly when I teach at a place like Harvard Divinity School, I can see the issue of the flux and the individuality of the people I teach. And that asking, and we don't ask, but asking people, are you a Christian? Are you a Catholic? Are you a Jew? Are you a Muslim? What is your tradition? We don't ask those kinds of questions because it's a secular university. But also it would be very complicated because students often have very complicated stories about who they are and what they are. And I think in some ways it's a good, honest move to the complexification of the fields, to not talk about Hindu and Christian as if we know what we're talking about, but rather in opening up the door, we may end up not having anything to talk about of the things we started with. And I think it'd be a mistake if we went too far in the direction of saying, let's get rid of these religious terms or theological terms and open the door to a much greater complexity. That complexity is good, but just like the complexity of history, it can be overwhelming and it kind of like shatter the very possibility of using language intelligently about the things we're talking about. To move on, I would like to say, if this is the situation we're in, where the fields have come together, the volumes that I talked about first are kind of defining the field and helping us to understand where interfaith, interreligious studies are. But if out of that study, one ends up with a variety of questions arising about history, about the current state of traditions, about whether the terminology we use is out of date or not, then I think we have to be realizing that part of what we do in the 21st century is need to be finding another basis for thinking about how we talk about these things. That if we leave it, to put it crudely, and I'm an academician, if we leave it to the professors, that we may end up without having an identifiable field of interfaith, interreligious studies at all, because it will break up into area studies and linguistic studies and historical studies and so on, all of which is very important in itself. We need those kinds of studies. But therefore, I think we have to be able to go back and to talk more deeply about where are we coming from and what are we doing? Why are we bothering being here tonight talking about these things? What is at stake for us? And for this, I think we need to go back and look at more individual stories about ourselves. You know, I think if we had a lot of time, we could go around the room tonight and begin to talk about why are we here? What are we looking for? What are we thinking? And I doubt if anybody would be here tonight simply for a discourse on religious terminology or the semantics of words like religion, culture, politics, or for some kind of deconstructive history of how religions have related to one another. My guess is that for many people, including many of ourselves, there is a certain kind of deeper faith drive that makes all of this important. And that if the faith drive is missing, or if the faith drive is erased, then in a sense the questions go away or they become unidentifiable as specifically the kinds of questions that would justify having the Institute or having the Center for the Study of World Religions at Harvard or other such organizations. We would no longer have the rationale for having these organizations in relationship to one another. So how do we think about this? I think by going back to ourselves. And this is, I don't want to pretend in any way to say that I'm saying something new here, because I think other volumes that have come out in the past years have talked at some length and persuasively about telling the stories of the individuals who are involved in the interfaith movement, that these are the stories that are cogent, these are the stories that drive us. And looking to ourselves for this, I think, is part of the story, not simply inspirational volumes on the side, but volumes that put the individual with the choices individuals make back in the center. So just to name, as I did before, several of the recent volumes that would, I think, speak to the experience of individuals. The volume that Jennifer Peace, Orr Rose, and Gregory Mobley put out about 12 years ago, Our Neighbor's Faith, Stories of Interreligious Encounter, Growth, and Transformation, getting back to the individuals who are involved in the field and the experiences of the individuals. A forthcoming volume edited by Lucinda Mosher, Best of Intentions, the mistakes we make in interreligious relations and how we learn from them. Individuals telling their stories of what they did mistakenly with the best of intentions and how they lose from that. That'll be out soon. James Fredericks and Tracy Tiemeyer, Interreligious Friendship After Vatican II, arguing, as others have argued, that it's in the friendships and the human relationships across religious traditions that we begin to realize what this is really all about. It's not about only the history. It's not only about the semantics of the terminology we used. It's not simply about the cultures and societies and so on, but it's about the personal relationships that are gathered. And the volume, again, reflects 15, 20 stories of individuals talking about their friendships. And another one that's about to come out, edited by Anne-Marie Ellithorpe, Hussam Timani, and Laura Duhan Kaplan, Multi-Religious Reflections on Friendship, Becoming Ourselves in Community. And I think volumes like this are good because they get individuals to come forward and tell their stories, individuals front and center. And I'm sure the Institute has done a good bit of this over the past 40 years of getting people to tell their stories. But sometimes the telling of the stories may be left out in the academic context. The reasons why people care about these issues can be lost sight of, and to put them back in play. One can go back, of course, much further in terms of understanding how stories are told. Diana Eck has her book 1991, Encountering God, A Spiritual Journey from Bozeman to Benares. How she, as a Harvard professor all these years, had also a basic fundamental faith journey that drove her to participate in this way. Sarah Grant, the Religions of the Sacred Heart, a sister who spent many years in India toward an alternative theology, Confessions of a Non-Dualist Christian. That came out in '91. John Moffat, some of you may know that name, was a gentleman who was a Protestant, grew up Protestant, became a Ramakrishna monk for over 20 years, and then left the Ramakrishna order and became a Roman Catholic in his latter years. And he has a book called Journey to Gorakhpur, An Encounter with Christ Beyond Christianity. And then finally, I have a favorite one from 1923. William Wallace was an evangelical Anglican missionary in Bengal in the late 19th century, early 20th century, who became so disillusioned with the mix of Anglicanism and colonialism in the Bengal context and the misrepresentation of the Hindu traditions. He left the mission. He went off and lived in a village. He learned Bengali. He began to learn from the people directly about their faith. And eventually, and I realize this sounds self-serving, he left the mission altogether, went back to Ireland where he came from, became a Roman Catholic, became a Jesuit, and then came back to India and rethought everything in that context, and writes this wonderful book about it all, From Evangelical to Catholic by Way of the East. And it's 100 years old, the book, but it's so contemporary in terms of his tracing his personal journey. And as Heather mentioned at the beginning, I'm writing a book, the name keeps changing a little bit, Hindu and Christian, Priest and Scholar, A Love Story. How can I talk about the fact that 50 years now, this summer will be 50 years since I first went to India? What is it that drives me over the years? And I think in some ways, I'd like to say it's a matter that is both interfaith and interreligious, to use the language of these volumes that I've been talking about. That in some sense, as a Catholic, as a Jesuit, I was teaching in a mission school in Kathmandu in the middle of the 1970s. I could have simply followed the path of being a person of interreligious dialogue, teaching Hindus and Buddhists in the school, and following that path. But then I also got a Ph.D. at the University of Chicago in the South Asia department, taught at Boston College, now I teach at Harvard. I could have also just been an academic and followed and said, no, this is all about cultural studies or political studies. Theology could be erased from it in order to simply have interreligious understanding. And so I think I've had to ask myself, in puttering with this book manuscript that hopefully will be done soon, to ask, why is it that I insist that it's about Hindu and Christian, priest and scholar, that the interfaith part doesn't go away? That I want to be a scholar and be a person of interfaith understanding at the same time, putting these things and holding them together. To tell you just one little anecdote, and I really am getting near the end of what I want to say, is that when I first got to Kathmandu in 1973, I was teaching in St. Xavier's School, it was a boarding school. All the boys I taught were Hindu and Buddhist. I was 22, I was just out of college, there I was in Kathmandu. My first time really outside of New York, much less in the East, basically in a whole new environment. And early on in my time there, some workers from the school took me outside the valley to a place called Dakshin Kali, literally the Southern Kali Temple. And they took me there because they were going to offer worship on a Tuesday morning. But it turned out, as I found out, Tuesdays and Saturdays, there are animal sacrifice in the temple there. So it's the goddess Kali, and there's animal sacrifice to the goddess on Tuesdays and Saturdays in a very village-like, non-sensational way. So in the backyard of your home in the village, you kill a chicken and you have dinner. You kill a goat at the time of the festival. On certain days, you bring the goat, you bring the chicken to the priest in the temple. It's sacrificed, the priest keeps part, you get part. So in some ways, it was humdrum and taken for granted. But for me, it was a totally new experience. It was something unlike anything I had experienced before, but puzzlingly, I felt at home with it. And I've had to ask myself then, but also more in recent years, why is it that this Irish Catholic kid from New York would go to Kathmandu and without any preparation suddenly find himself one Tuesday morning at a temple of a goddess where animal sacrifice is being offered and say to it in some elemental way, yes, I get what this is about. And I think, to give you the short answer, because I could go on for an hour, I won't do that. In some elemental way, it had to do with the fact that I was entering on like a double formation in my life. So I was Catholic, I went to grammar school with the nuns, I went to high school with the priests, I was an altar boy, I learned Latin as an altar boy, all this stuff, and then I became a seminarian at age 18. So I was in this kind of Jesuit track of learning. But what I was beginning when I got to Kathmandu was a second formation, a second way of opening up the reality of who I am by beginning in practice, in teaching, in studying, in traveling, later in deeper study of Hindu texts, to begin to kind of form myself a second time in the Hindu traditions. And I think what this has done for me, and the reason I mention this, is that neither at Dakshin Kali in the beginning, nor when I was a student at University of Chicago in the late 70s, or several times in India studying with teachers, or as a priest saying Mass in the parish on the weekends as I do, at no point has it sort of flattened out into, well, let's forget about Hindu and Christian and let's talk about lived religion or some other reality, or say that the religions are all the same, or to say that it's taboo, you can't do both of these, you have to make a choice. But rather, I think I found at a very deep level that it was the metaphor of crossing over and coming back. You go to the other is other. The other is a different place, a different world, and it could be, it doesn't have to be Hindu and Catholic, obviously, different traditions. But you go, you learn, you're transformed, you become a different person, and then you cross back. And I think this is a faith position, not an interreligious studies position. That interreligious studies, for good reasons and very intellectually riveting reasons at times, can erase things like geography or complain about kind of colonial fixtures on places that need to be, if not conquered, at least taken into account. But rather at a deeper level, people of faith are pilgrims. People of faith are making journeys. And that works well because in our own faith, we are different from people of other faiths. But because we're people who are committed to living in the world in which we live and have an understanding of God, which I'll talk about in the next lecture, somehow we believe that we're driven from where we are at home to where we're not at home, and we find God there. Our faith lives there as well. And I think if this is not held on to, and if we reduce the history to all kinds of other issues, then we will have interreligious studies, but interreligious studies will eventually become cross-cultural studies, will become area studies, will become other things. And I think that's important, and I think it would be therefore a way of us saying, what is the boundary, what is the ground on which we think about interfaith, interreligious studies in the future? There is this inevitable tension that should be there between interfaith and interreligious, and I'm not the one to say or erase it, don't pretend that the tension is not there, but that the interreligious is actually an offspring of the interfaith, and that the interfaith always, at least primordially, conceptually comes first, and interreligious reflection is a second order of reflection on interfaith. That people of faith have experiences, and the interreligious realm in the academy is trying to catch up with where people of faith are. If you turn it around, I think it won't work so well because the faith element may be pushed to the side and left out. And I say that all in a certain kind of self-interest, because when I look back over the past 50 years, back to Dakshin Kali Temple, that holding these things together and making sense of crossing over and back, which I'm still doing 50 years later, is in a sense living out that reality, faith first, driven by faith outside my comfort zone, learning interreligiously, thinking about it, writing about it, teaching about it, and so on. But the interreligious is always secondary to the faith. And that's my thesis. We can stop almost with this. I have one more point to make and talk about this, whether this is convincing or not. Interfaith enables interreligious to happen. If you turn it around, it doesn't happen. But to conclude, I'm writing an autobiography, this book that is coming along pretty well. And it reminds me of all the interesting things I've done. I have no great stories, nothing very sensational happened in my life, et cetera. It's a matter of doing certain things and just doing them for 50 years or 70 years, whatever, rather consistent. But what it does remind me is that as you get older, you have to realize that the terms on which younger people think about all these things are going to be different from what you found. So I was educated by the nuns. I learned Latin as an altar boy. I went to a Jesuit high school. I learned Latin and Greek in high school. I was ordained a priest. All of these things made sense in the 60s and 70s in a way that I think is generally impossible for a younger person today to say, oh yes, that's my experience. Oh yes, I grew up in a pious Roman Catholic Irish New York family, or Polish family, or this family or that family. No, younger people today, I think, have different discourse, different experiences, and there are younger people here who can speak up in a minute, whether I'm speaking for you when I shouldn't be. But that we need to have a multi-generational conversation. And so the high ambition and the wonderful nature of this dialogue we're having, in this series is getting, maybe often senior people in the field, but it doesn't work very well. And we'll have a younger person tomorrow night with Shubha Pathak. It doesn't work well if older people are talking to older people about older things. And so I think it's a matter of how do we have a further conversation. And I would just close by one and a half references. I think some of the work that Ibu Patel has done with the Interfaith Youth Corps and having conversations on campuses and having younger people engaged in the dialogue. And I'm sure through the Institute and other organizations getting young people involved. But older people like me have to be able to let go and say, yes, but they're going to talk about it in different ways on their own terms. And it's not going to look like what I experienced when I was 25 or 45 or 65. It's going to be different. And I'd highlight, finally, you mentioned, Heather mentioned that I was president of the Catholic Theological Society. I was president-elect last year. And that means I planned the convention in Atlanta, Learning Catholic Interreligiously. It's wonderful proceedings online you can get. But the third plenary at it was 3 younger scholars talking about comparative theology, present experience, remembered past, and imagined futures. And they were, to my eyes, all young people, but one, Reed Lachlan, was 50-ish, Mara Brecht, 40-ish, and Stephanie Wong, 30-ish. And the 3 of them, and they also played with the idea of the Christmas Carol, the ghost of Christmas, past, present, and future. But they raised the point that all of this is generationally inflected. And just to close, I'd say what Stephanie Wong, in her final contribution to this beautiful presentation they did at the CTSA in Atlanta, in her contribution, she said there are 3 things we need to be thinking about or worrying about. Comparative theology, because that was the topic, and the academic multiverse. And she says, it is no longer the case that we use in stable fashions terms like history, classics, philosophy, theology. Anyone who's starting out today finds these fields are diversifying madly, and they're complexifying all over the place, so that if you study religion, you spend a lot of time saying, what is religion? Is there such a thing as religion? all these fields are constantly changing themselves, thinking themselves through, and that you can't, maybe we did 50 years ago, stably think about these different disciplines. And there's this and this and this and this, and they work. She says, well, now that's not what young people experience. Everything is open to flux. Even in solid departments of religious studies or theology or philosophy, it's constantly being debated, what are we doing and why are we doing it? That's the first one. The second one, the comparative theology and the political. And in various ways, and usually nicely or patiently, people will criticize somebody like me for saying, well, look, you love to read your Sanskrit texts and your Tamil texts, and you love to read commentaries and do scholastic studies and so on like that. But what about the burning issues of our time, which obviously were the issues of their time too? What about injustice in society? What about the excluded voices? What about the biases built into any of our great religious traditions that produced a certain kind of canon of books with certain kind of experts allowed to write the commentaries and certain kings paying for the temples and then other things erased? That it's impossible, she's saying, for younger people today to not be hypersensitive about the political implications of the work we do, in terms of studying the past, in terms of what we read, whether we can bear to read such text anymore, and in terms of if I'm in a doctoral program today as a student, or if I'm a young professor starting out, what are my obligations in terms of ethical responsibility are very different, it seems, than 50 years ago. Now, 50 years ago was, the 60s and 70s, the Vietnam War era, everything kind of fell apart. So it wasn't a naive period. But she's saying we have to be political today in a way that wasn't in the past. And then finally, she says, she calls it the age of overwhelm. And she says, for young people today, it is not the kind of thing you can pick up when you're 22, as I did. Interreligious reality, the fact of different religious traditions. Isn't that interesting? I think I'll look into it. She says, for young people today, and I think it's through simply being alive in American culture, but through online media, all kinds of ways that young people are relating to one another, we're constantly being bombarded, she says, with the fact of pluralism, religious pluralism, interfaith realities, that we can't get away from it. And that anything anyone says at any time is always being measured against what did you leave out? Whose tradition did you not take seriously? And the plurality of the possibilities, she says, can be overwhelming for young people. And that too has to be taken into account. So I'll stop with that, but the point of all that was to say, somebody like me can give a presentation, which I hope was somewhat coherent, about the things we can worry about after these great volumes. But to say that once we've done our work of setting it out as we see it, then we have to turn it over and have a conversation among ourselves with the younger people in our midst in order to be able to think differently about where all this leads us. So I hope we can talk about this now, and I hope I'm looking forward to a good conversation. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Frank. We're going to take a 2-minute break to get set up for Q&A over here. And I also want to remind you about slido.com. If you want to ask questions for Professor Clooney, you can do so. And the code is 593-9430. Again, we'll take just a 2-minute break. The question and answer portion of tonight's program with Professor Frank Clooney. I'm delighted to have you all here at the Silber-Obrecht Lecture from the Institute for Islamic, Christian, and Jewish Studies in Baltimore, Maryland. We've got some great questions coming in on the app, and so let's just dive right in. From someone in the audience, what should we do with the religiously unaffiliated, the so-called nuns, or people who don't claim a faith tradition? Are we ignoring them at our peril? How are they included? How could they be included into the interfaith framing of your thesis statement?
This is a great question. I think it follows from where I ended, talking about the intergenerational conversation we need to have. And I run into this, as any of us teaching on campuses run into it, but certainly Harvard Divinity School is a a place where this is a very prominent issue. Younger people saying, well, that's fine, the work you do, you grew up in this tradition, it was coherent, it was fixed, you all went to church and so on like that. We don't, I don't want to, I have multiple belongings, I'm spiritual but not religious, et cetera, and I think part of the dynamic would be for the thriving of the future of this field, however we call it, let's say interfaith, interreligious for short, that there has to be a way to not ignore people who are spiritual but not religious, or any of the terms related to that. Because in some ways, first of all, it's just practical demographics. There are a lot of young people and some older people who are in that position. But also, as in all the historical cases we learned from these volumes I mentioned and so on, theology and religious participation follow upon paying attention to the culture in which one lives. And that closing the door and saying, no, 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 that's all mistaken, I think would be the wrong way to go. When I'm teaching at Harvard, but to the extent at BC, Boston College beforehand, was when somebody would say, but I don't come from a tradition. I don't have that kind of affiliation. I would say, but you do come from somewhere. So what is the autobiography of a younger person who has reasons and motivations why they might be interested in religion or have religious questions or care enough about it to say I'm spiritual and not religious, or I'm a nun? That you have a story to tell. It may have to do with the complex understanding of your family growing up. When you were growing up, your parents, one converted this way, one stopped going to church that way. In school, you met other people, you tried this, you tried that. Tell that story, and then we can read, as I did in one course, read Augustine, St. Augustine together, read Confucius together, read Shankara, the Hindu theologian, together. But I read it from my background, you read it from your background, and I think that can work, provided it's a context in which a kind of a flattening secularism doesn't, stamp out the religious possibilities that people do experience, but they don't have traditional words for what they're experiencing. I don't know if that makes sense.
I want to stay with the idea of terms and terminology, because I think you nicely pointed out in the lecture that the term religion is being interrogated and deconstructed. Faith and interfaith is doing the same. Does the term interfaith itself carry a sort of set of Christian assumptions that centers faith and belief and orthodoxy? Is there another more neutral term of belonging that you've encountered that you would prefer or like to use or think has something evocative about it?
I think I'm not sure who I'm talking to you in the room, but I'm also talking to the two cameras. So don't be offended if I'm looking over your heads. I think this raises a very important question about what terms can we use without using them naively or imperialistically, and what terms can we be critical of without being so paralyzed we can't use any terms. I mean, it's a general thing it's the problem of the English language as the world's dominant language at the moment. It's the problem of, or it's the phenomenon that the Christian message has, so permeated the English language that when we use words like faith, grace, sin, redemption, salvation, personal relationship to God, devotion, all of these words have such strong resonances in Christian tradition. Tomorrow night I'll talk a little bit about translation issues. I'm going to give you some examples of Hindu poetry I've translated and talk about the issues related to translation and where you can go with that. So I think in one level, when we use a term like interfaith, we shouldn't use it naively and say, okay, we all know what faith means, no matter which tradition you belong to. We know what tradition means, whichever tradition you belong to, and so on like that. That we shouldn't do it naively, and we shouldn't do it in a way that forces people to say, okay, we're going to have faith sharing, my faith, now it's your turn to share your faith. And for some, it may not make sense to divide things up in that fashion. There's been a move in the Hindu Christian Studies Society at the American Academy of Religion this coming year has a panel that may have a panel that is going to try to talk about indigenous terminologies from Indian languages that could be used to recast how we think about interfaith, interreligious. If you stop using the dominant English words and use words from other traditions, can you change the dynamic by not always privileging a Western language, and particularly English? But in the short run, is there a better term than interfaith? I think interfaith works in some ways because it's in tension with interreligious. We at Harvard have not an interfaith, but a multi-faith common prayer space. Is multi-faith better than interfaith? I'm not sure. Scholars will puzzle over the inter and say we should get rid of the inter. I think the real way out of this would be to say faith doesn't mean simply a cognitive assent to a doctrine. Faith doesn't necessarily mean believing in a creed, but faith can be this existential living relationship to God, to the goddess, to reality in some deep sense. So if one has a flexible enough sense of the word faith, it may still work well, but I'd be open, I'd love to hear alternatives. What would be a better term to use than interfaith? Therefore, turning the question back on the questioner, can any of us think about better terms than that without ending up unintelligible by not using religious terms at all? And then acting as if words like philosophy or culture somehow are intact and are not problematic. Everything is problematic. So we might as well use something.
I'm going to try to combine a few questions here. There are folks who are thinking about the academy and the academic study of religion and interreligious and interfaith studies. Given your perspective on the importance of faith, what of atheist members of the academy, and perhaps on the flip side, evangelizing members of the academy?
Again, an excellent question. I think of myself as kind of a middle-of-the-road person who has it both ways, and that on the one hand, arguing a perspective, and I thought it was part of my duty tonight to actually have a point to what I said, not simply to be descriptive, and so arguing for the primacy of faith and the interfaith and the dependence and secondary nature of interreligious on faith is a position to put forward, but I think it can be understood generously and not like in a rigid, exclusive fashion. And so while there are problems with saying, well, faith is quite compatible with being an atheist, or as some say, a humanist, I think without believing that these terms can be used in any number of ways, arguing that faith is central, I don't think has to be saying that a person who has no faith tradition or prefers to call themselves an atheist has no place at a meeting like the American Academy of Religion. I don't think it would have to mean that, but I do think there has to be a way of saying we're studying religion. Religion is a derivative term. I think faith comes first. And that you who are an atheist or a humanist have to be able to give the genealogy of what you mean. Atheism as Buddhism, Buddhism is atheist, or atheism as a non-personal deity, or other terms. A totally secular view which would explain away religion, faith, the transcendent entirely, I think could simply be a respectable, honorable voice that needs to be heard in the academy, but it may not have much to do with interfaith, interreligious studies. That if one doesn't want to use any kind of vertical terminology at all, then it may simply be a different conversation. Just as when you go to the other end of the spectrum, talking about like an evangelical participation in academic debates. Academic debates should have room for true believers, evangelical believers, even very conservative believers should be welcomed into the conversation. But if somebody's coming into the conversation in order to persuade everyone to stop thinking and start believing, well, that would not be appropriate to the academy. Because I think, again, I see it as, my own experience, but also I think it works in the Hindu traditions I study and many other religious traditions. Intelligence and faith can go together, and that we're better off when intelligence, inquiry, and faith go together. And if somebody says inquiry only, no faith, if somebody says faith only and no inquiry, I think those positions are deficient by comparison. But I'm willing to be argued back.
As a follow-up to that, then what is the ultimate goal of academic inquiry and discussion? If that...
I mean, I think again, to go back to the very simple understanding of theology as faith-seeking understanding. We just had the feast in the Catholic Church of St. Anselm the other day, and it goes back to Augustine. Faith is not solid, finished, just because it's faith. Understanding matters too. And the seeking is not, only in the past tense, but the seeking is an ongoing practice. I think faith-seeking understanding is it's too simple, but nonetheless is a way of thinking about what theology is, therefore finds a place within a larger theological frame for the study of religion. Because the study of religion has to do with historical study, philological study, cultural studies, sociological studies, and anthropological studies, and on, to say, well, what does it mean when believers say this is what they're doing or this is what they're believing? A certain kind of understanding that, in some sense, in itself is valuable. To understand is better than to not understand insofar as it's possible. But that, from a faith perspective, it would be a deeper understanding of what we have faith in, who we have faith in, and the limits of that faith. Where does it fall down? Where does it break? Where does the language no longer work? Now, does that describe the academy today? I mean, as any field, clerics in churches, clerics in religious traditions, sometimes what started out as a faith endeavor just becomes, it's my job. That's what I have my degree in, that's where I get paid, how I put food on the table. People could be in the study of religion or politics or teaching in seminaries because that's what they do and they can't do anything else. And that's where they are. And I think that can be a reality of life, that there may be a way in which I'm a really good expert at this aspect of the study of religion, but it has nothing to do with faith or higher reality or the horizon of being. That's what I do. And I think that can be respected as a reality, but saying that for most of the time, understanding contributes to the ongoing quest of faith to understand. And that there's an intellectual component to being a believer that is necessary for the believers to be human, the believers to be alive, the believers to be active, that is fulfilled through organizations like, again, the American Academy of Religion, that are incredibly valuable to believers in traditions. And yet, what is the purpose of the American Academy of Religion if the category of religion breaks up, and if there is no sense of believing the things that one studies? It becomes problematic, and therefore needs to be reconnected, I think, to faith.
At the end of your lecture, you referenced Stephanie Wong's insights from the CTSA gathering in Atlanta about sort of the political realities, the context for interreligious work. And so I have a couple of questions about this current moment. And one is about sort of religious nationalisms. And as a scholar and a committed practitioner in Christian Hindu relations, do you have any sort of thoughts about sort of Christian nationalism and Hindu nationalism as they're sort of manifesting right now?
Next question. I mean, this precisely, I think, is the kind of thing that Stephanie Wong and her part of that plenary was talking about, that it's not possible now for people of her generation, but in reality, it wasn't really possible 50 years ago or 100 years ago to be totally oblivious to the political context in which we study. There may have been an era of Western triumphalism or Western Christian triumphalism in which it was taken for granted that we are on the cutting edge of history and what we do is wonderful and we've civilized the world and all that kind of language. I think today there is obviously a greater sense that the political can be corrupting the spiritual, and that there are ways in which turning a blind eye to what's going on around us can be shirking our human responsibility, to pay attention to justice and injustice in the world around us. What does that mean, though? I mean, on one level, to not romanticize or idealize the traditions we live in. So, let's say, what I am related to, the Roman Catholic Church has had over a very long period of time all kinds of wonderful and utterly corrupt relationships to political power and totalitarian enforcement of one set of beliefs, depriving people of their beliefs. There are times in which the history of Hinduism, because Hinduism has a history too, it's not the eternal East, in which there's been a very close relationship between political power and religious power. And there are moments in Indian history in which the political seems to dominate over the spiritual. And I think, specifically, and this is going in way over my head, to say that what's happening with India, which is now apparently population-wise the largest country in the world, as a country recovering its own identity, basically after 1,000 years of foreign rule, from the first time Muslim rulers came into India with the Portuguese, the French, the British, and so on like that. 1947 and independence is not that long ago, not even 100 years. People like Prime Minister Modi, who, like any politician can, infuriate some people and is highly popular with other people, I think is part of articulating the identity of the India of the future. A country that's perhaps 85% Hindu, finding itself, what does it mean to be a country, a political system, a regime, a democracy that is grounded in Hindu values? And I think that shouldn't be simply written off as fundamentalist. Just as I would say in some Christian contexts, a Christian effort to define society should not be entirely written off, but there have to be safeguards and breaks to respect minorities, to allow, to ensure that the mistake of the majority terrorizing the minority is not allowed. And there has to be a way of saying, if our faith tradition is valid and important and has truth to it, it should not be afraid of dissent. It should not squash voices that are trying to say something different. And this applies, to the Irish Catholic Church in Ireland of the 19th century, and of this or that country in the 21st century, allowing truth to be proclaimed while still saying our culture is rooted in certain religious traditions and not all religious traditions, I think works. Finally, what does the scholar do? I think in some ways it would be counterproductive to say everybody should be facing up to the political realities of fundamentalism and overly dominant governments and all that. Some people should still be philologists, and some people should still be reading the classic texts and doing their work on rituals and so on like that. Not everybody has to be doing the political, but I think to be naive and to tell our students it doesn't matter, that would be a travesty. So it does matter, but nonetheless I'm going to do this and I can't do that too. Because so many people who are involved in the political and the economic and the social never read a classical text, they never learn a foreign language, they never learn the traditions, and that's a bad thing too. I'm juggling many things here.
Another question about sort of this current moment, I think is grounded in a sense of fear and loneliness. If we think about the impact of friendship, bringing people into this work, into interreligious and interfaith work, what do we do about our country where people fear others knocking on their door?
Yeah, these terrible scenes lately, ring the doorbell and get shot, drive down the wrong driveway and get shot at and somebody gets killed. I mean, in some sense, I think it's not a matter of optimism. But I think it can be a matter of hope to say that despite the fact of the extreme examples of violence in a country that has way too many guns, I think many of us would just believe that, way too many guns, that there is violence, there is an effort to stand your ground and get rid of the stranger, keep them away because they're a threat, that is not the dominant position. And that 98% of the people actually have friends who are different from themselves in religion, in ethnic background, in race, in sexual identity, and on and on. And that most people do manage to live together in harmony. And I think maybe the countercultural thing would be, just as somebody could be radically nonviolent, and in a violent society say, I adhere to the tradition of Dorothy Day and Mahatma Gandhi, and I stand for an uncompromising nonviolence in society. In a society where some people cynically benefit from hatred of the stranger, building greater and greater barriers to prevent people from entering the country, and so on. To testify and say, on the simplest level, it doesn't have to be a matter of a Ph.D. or a teaching position or this or that, building friendships across religious divides is the counter witness that is needed. The religious divides and all the other divides, to say, despite that, we have friends, we have bonds, we have mutual commitments across the boundaries, can be the counter witness. But even if people say, well, that's fine, it's all good, but what good will it do? What good will it do to be a Gandhi or a Dorothy Day or a Martin Luther King or a Nelson Mandela? What good does it do when the people with the guns always kind of terrorize other people? But I think, what else can we do but say we have religious values, we stand for deeper transcendental truths that are manifest in simple ways like caring for one another in friendship, and that witness will make a difference even in a society where you can get shot if you ring the wrong doorbell. We have to believe, I think, that simple acts of friendship and love make a difference.
We have time for one more question, and there are a lot of good ones to choose from here, so I apologize for those who did not get their question answered this evening. Let's end on some exegesis, some New Testament exegesis. So this is coming in today's gospel reading from Mark states, quote, "Whoever believes and is baptized will be saved. Whoever does not believe will be condemned," unquote. Please address.
Is there a New Testament scholar in the audience? I think, we really would have to get our Bible. Do you have like 20 Bibles here? We could get them out and all read it together. I think there are those passages, that's from Mark 16, is it?
I don't know.
Okay.
I could look it up.
Well, no, it's okay.
Yeah.
Because we've also had readings at Mass the last couple of weeks, from the early chapters of the Acts of the Apostles. Peter talking to the leaders of the people, saying, "You killed the Messiah. You lost. You didn't know who it was. You missed your chance. By no other name can anyone be saved." And I think there are several levels to this, because we all have to think about this in interreligious context. By no other name can you be saved. Jesus alone is the way, the truth, and the life, and so on. These truths cannot be simply discarded and say, well, let's just ignore that, or let's leave these passages out, or radical passages that seem to be exclusive in the Quran, or in the Hebrew Bible, or in the Bhagavad Gita, or other texts of the world, that seem to leave no room for the other. I think on the one hand, if we have a sense of, again, I'm really outside my field, a sense that the Word of God comes to us as a whole, not simply as a quote. We're responsible to the sacred text of our traditions, and we really don't have the right to say, oh, I like that part, I don't like that part, I like that part, I leave that part out, let's never talk about that part. On the one hand, we have that responsibility to take the whole of it. we have the responsibility, again, this is where maybe the Academy comes in, if not the American Academy of Religion, the Society of Biblical Literature, which meets with the AAR, to look at these passages in their context and to not be afraid to understand them rather than simply quote them. That's the second thing. And then to say, well, within the reading of the whole Gospel of Mark or the whole Acts of the Apostles, let's say, then how are we to understand this passage now in the 21st century in which we live? Again, because I don't believe necessarily, as I said before, we're all progressing and better all the time. Everything is wonderful now. We're not able to simply throw these truths out the window. But I don't think we're required to say, well, that verse from that chapter of Mark somehow is the handle or the basis on which we can pass judgment on religions we know nothing about. I think for some, it gets tricky because you can end up explaining things away. But if you take even the Jesus of, let's say, the Gospel of John, and I am the way, the truth, and the life, is the Jesus of the Gospel of John a figure who would have no time or patience for people of other faith traditions? I don't think you can say that if you actually read the Gospel of John instead of picking out one verse here or there. Because Jesus is the one who talks to the Samaritan woman. He cures the centurion's son. He seems to be reaching out in different directions. That can't be predicted by saying, well, he said the way, the truth, and the life. That somehow is a judgment on the Dalai Lama or Mahatma Gandhi. It doesn't seem to make sense to use Jesus in that way. So I think maybe it gets into, as the case with all our conversations, the interreligious, interfaith conversations then require further conversations in the traditions to which we belong. What do we do? And so much has been written about these. Not at all in my field. What do we do about the challenging texts that are countercultural and indeed seem to be impatient with interreligious understanding in our sacred scriptures? Catholics and Catholics need to talk. Catholics and Protestants and Orthodox need to talk. Reformed Jews and Orthodox Jews need to talk. Hindus of different persuasions need to talk. Muslims of different traditions need to talk among themselves, ourselves, saying that we need to open up a better conversation about the things our sacred texts say so that we don't use or abuse our sacred texts inappropriately, ignorantly, in interreligious contexts. So I think I'll stop with that. On the one hand, we have no right to simply dismiss such texts. But on the other hand, we have a right to say these texts subsist in the traditions to which we belong, and our living traditions are continuing to learn what the texts mean and how to use them. And I think that intelligence is just as obligatory as taking seriously the words on the page.
Well, please join me in thanking Dr. Clooney for...
Thank you. I just add that now that we're ending the formal session, anyone who's in the room here, actually, I'd be happy to talk further. But thank you all for coming tonight. Thank you for those who have listened in online, and come back tomorrow.
Yeah, 4 o'clock tomorrow. We'll be in the same space. And if you're online, you can find us at the same YouTube channel. And we look forward to being with you.
Thank you all. Yeah.
It's a different channel. It's a different YouTube channel.
Oh, all right.